Hello, my name is Gregg Braden, and I know that if you're watching me today, you have seen the program Missing Links. And we have a lot of people that are asking me questions behind the scenes. What has happened in my life? What was involved? What have I found? When I was pulling that information together, and I think you're probably aware, it's just the tip of the iceberg of all of the research that went into putting this series together. We know our world is changing, and I think one of the most common themes of the questions that people ask me from all over the world, every culture, every continent that I'm on, two things: economy, self-sustainability. How do we bring those into our lives? And that's what I want to talk to you about today. So when I hear questions coming to me about economy, one of the first things that I've found is that the word itself means different things to different people. Economy, for some people, is about money. But I want to say today that economy is much more than money. It can be about money, but it's more about us. It's about people. It's about the way we share the things that we need to sustain us in our everyday lives, the way we share food, energy, medicine, communications, the vital things that are necessary in everyday life. Those are the things that are changing in our world today. We have found ourselves in a world where much of our economy has been centralized. And what's changing now in our time of extremes is we see the climate change, and we see all of the factors of conflict, and we see all of the factors of the financial economy changing. All those systems coming together. What we're finding is this centralized model no longer works anymore. So when people ask me, what is it that they can do in their own lives? The answer for me is very simple. The key is a localized economy. Localized economy. What does that mean? It means living within our means in a local community, while that community is part of an even greater community that can be a nation, it can be a planet. It means localized forms of energy. It means localized sources of food. It means localized businesses. It means localized money, localized loans. These are the things that are sustainable in a time of extremes, when the world is going through a time of such volatility and uncertainty. It is the fragile, centralized system that is most at risk. And it's this system that you and I sense. We feel it. We don't need someone to tell us. We know this system's at risk. And this is where a lot of the fear comes from. What if? What if the banks fail? What if the storms from the climate change are so bad that delivery trucks can't come across the roads into the mountain communities of Colorado and New Mexico, which has just happened recently? These are real-time things. This isn't just a make-believe hypothesis. What do we do then? And this is where people get nervous. The key here in localized living is we don't have to worry about any of those things. Let me just give you a quick example. A couple of years ago, there was a bacteria that was found on certain kinds of fruits, melons, cantaloupes, that were being grown in portions of the Rocky Mountain area. And they pulled these from the grocery store shelves. They were warning people not to eat these things. They were having the same problems with lettuces. They were having the same problems with broccoli. And there was another bacterial issue with eggs, with fresh eggs. I live in the high deserts of northern New Mexico, a rural, localized economy. We went to our neighborhood restaurants and we had no problem. We didn't have to worry about any of those things because our food came from about a block away from where the restaurant was, farm to table. And I know many of you listening to this, you're already experiencing this because it has made sense. What I want you to know is that it's more than a convenience. This is the way of sustainable living in our future. And just as the localized sources of food work to help us provide reliable systems that we can count on, the same thing is true for energy. You know, energy is determined by environment. Not every environment supports the same kind of energy. If you're living out west and you have a lot of sun, solar makes tremendous sense. If you're living under a lot of cloud cover in a rainforest in Byron Bay, Australia, it doesn't make quite so much sense. There are other forms of energy. The key is that one size does not fit all, and this is where the centralized model in the past has gotten us into trouble. It has invited us to rely upon a single source of energy, mostly burning of fossil fuels, that we know is not sustainable and it's causing more problems now, when in fact we have so many localized and sustainable ways of living. And some of them are conventional, some of them are unconventional. We all know about wind. Here in northern New Mexico, we have geothermal because of the volcanic activity. Drill a hole in the ground, pump water into the molten lava. It turns into steam. That steam drives the turbines, and you've got a beautiful source of electricity that's not dependent on sun or wind. So these are examples of the kinds of things in the near term. One of the other questions that people ask all the time is, what about free energy? As a scientist, what I can say to you is the principles of free energy, the physics exist, and we are surrounded, we are bathed in energy that can be tapped and used in a very real and a commercial way. Realistically, are those systems available right now? What I say to people that ask me this, I say, why aren't we using these things right now? And I say to them, the systems that are available now, to the best of my knowledge, I wouldn't want to depend on those systems. If I were in an operating table in an operating room and knew that those systems were running all the power, or if I were in an airplane, depending upon those systems for navigation and guidance, they're not at the point where I would want those things, my life to depend upon them. I think what we're seeing is a gradation. It's a phasing in of these new forms of energy and forms of economy. Humans are very interesting in this respect. And we've talked about this a little bit before, in that we seem to learn what we do not want by experiencing that first, rather than simply saying, this is the way we choose to live, and let's put all of our energy into making these things happen. It seems that we experience war, for example, before we say we don't want that, we want peace. Or we experience a breakdown in the financial system before we say we don't want that. You know, let's regulate that. So we could in a 6-month period of time, the leaders of the world could come together and say, hey, look, all these new technologies already exist. Let's put the world on hold. Let's put our people to work. Let's give people jobs. Let's rebuild an infrastructure. And 6 months from now, we're going to push a button. We're going to be clean, green, sustainable, smart grid. And we'll never look back at fossil fuels again. That could happen. Is it going to happen realistically? Probably not. So realistically, what we're doing is we're doing this piecemeal, step by step, as aspects of the centralized forms of economy: food, medicine, communications, energy, defense, all these things, finances. As they break down, we're fixing them piecemeal. And I'm not saying it's good, bad, right, or wrong. It just is a path we've taken. Ultimately, They are stepping stones. They're leading us toward what you and I both know is possible for us and our children and our world, and that is a world where we live in harmony with nature. Localized living is the way nature works, and that should be the model for the way we live our lives. So one of the questions that people ask me all the time, and this is true every country I go to, when they talk about the economy, they're being very specific about money. And then this is the physical money that we all use and that we all depend on. They say, where are we going with the money? What's happening with the money? So I'm going to preface this. I'm a scientist, and when I give you a scientific answer, I identify it as a scientific answer. I'm not an economist. I've spent a lot of my energy researching this, so I'm going to share with you what I have found to be true to the best of my knowledge. The global financial system is changing, and one of the reasons it's changing is because it is now a global financial system. We never have had this in the history of the world. The world has never been connected the way that we see the world connected now. We've never lived in a truly globalized society. And people ask me all the time, are we going to a global government? A one world government? Are we going to a one world currency? And my answer to them is we're pretty much already there. Nobody told us when it happened. It wasn't like flash, CNN, BBC World, one world government, one world monetary system. But if you think about it, we've got a 24/7 global stock exchange. We already have that. 24/7 global news, 24/7 global communications. We've already got global defense. We've got global energy sharing, global technology, global medicine. The way that governments are now working together in many respects, they are cooperating in a global sense. So where are we going with all this? Ultimately, at some point, I think we will see more of what we would interpret as a global government. It doesn't mean that there is one person that's dictating what's happening with everyone else. It is more the sense where the world has the opportunity to chime in on the input of the policies that are happening. And I think you're already seeing this happen in our world today. And the same is true with money. So this is where I'm going with this. People ask, are we going to lose physical money? My sense is we will always have among us in our communities, we'll always have an Australian dollar or a Canadian dollar, an American dollar to exchange at the grocery store, or for a tank of gas. But the role of that dollar is going to change. And there are already efforts right now. The G20 met recently. This is the year 2017. 2016, and as far back as 2008, 2009, after the financial crisis, they've proposed, the G20, the 20 most powerful economic forces on the earth, proposing a cashless society. So is that good or bad? Is it right or wrong? People ask me that. I say it's all about how it's implemented. If it's implemented for the purpose of bringing people together for accountability and to honor people and the way that we exchange vital resources, it could be a very good thing. If it is implemented with the greed that we have seen in the past from large centralized banks and corporations, we already know what that looks like because we're living it right now. So ultimately, when we're talking about a global currency, is it going to happen? Well, I can tell you is it's already here. We already have a global currency. It's a currency that very few people have heard about, but it's already in use between the central banks. It's called the SDR. SDR means special drawing rights. This is a form of currency when the Federal Reserve, for example, gives money to the European Central Bank or something like that. This is the currency that they use. And because it is a solvent currency, it is not burdened in the way that other currencies are right now, including the dollar. It's being accepted as a global currency. So this is a currency that's going to be used, it's already existing. It'll be used in more widespread and more applications is how it will be used. When it comes down to us in our everyday lives, this is what people are really interested in. As I mentioned, I think we'll still use our local currencies for the time being. Ultimately, I think we are moving toward a cashless society. And there have been movements, some countries are already taking denominations of their currency out of circulation. And I personally have been to businesses here in the United States that refuse my cash. I was staying at a hotel, had an early flight. I won't share the name of the hotel chain. I went to the front desk and I was trying to use credit cards as little as possible. And they said, we are not equipped to take your cash to pay for this. And I recently was at a restaurant and had the same thing. I didn't even think twice about it. I paid the man cash because I don't like to use credit cards when I'm traveling so much because of identity theft and things like that. And they refused my cash. So this is already happening in some places. I want to say one more thing quickly. In rural communities, the idea of a cashless society has been around for a very long time. And we see these not only in the mountain states or in the high deserts, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, but I've seen them back east as well, barter. And there are very formalized ways of doing barter where people register their particular skills or their talents. It's like a tally sheet. And when someone needs a roof on their house, the person that can do the roof goes and puts the roof on their house and charges so many, they're called green units. The system is you don't exchange them hand to hand. So many green units went into putting the roof on that house, and now someone needs a transmission in their car, and another person will go and the exchange happens on this tally sheet, so that ultimately people are getting what they need from their neighbors in a sustainable way without any cash ever changing hands. It's very difficult to tax, and this is a problem where the IRS has a big problem with things like this for this reason. So it's not a perfect system, but it is a system that is in place and is used commonly. My experience, this is what I think is happening. In steps, we're moving toward a cashless society. These are some of the steps we'll go through: the global currency, the devaluing of our local currencies, ultimately to the point where we are electronic currencies. People ask about Bitcoin all the time. I'm not a Bitcoin expert. I'm not a big fan of Bitcoin. I think the idea, I like the idea. The way it was implemented, I think it could have been done better. There's some loopholes, and I think we've all seen some of the drawbacks where the Bitcoin has lost value overnight, and people lost tremendous amounts of money. It can be implemented, I think, in a better way. But we're in uncharted territory. This is the thing. We are a global community in an uncharted territory, forging our way forward, trying to do something that's never been done before. And I think that's exciting. And I couldn't think of a more exciting time to be experimenting with all of these different things. But I think the key here is when we find that something doesn't work, rather than clinging to it and trying to force a square peg in a round hole, like we see happening in the European Union right now, which is undergoing a change because one policy set in one nation cannot possibly fit for all of the 28 nations that were involved originally in the European Union. So it's changing to reflect that. And I think the smart thing for us to do, if we have the wisdom to recognize when a system is no longer working, to allow the change to flow and to find the new ways to implement what does work rather than trying to cling to something that's not sustainable and forcing it where people aren't accepting it. People ask me all the time if I sense that we are heading toward a crash in the economic system, whether it's America's economy or whether it's a global economy. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know that we're heading toward a crash. What I do know is this: the system that is in place right now is being stretched like a rubber band. And it can only stretch so far. Something has to give. Where the stretching is occurring right now is the debt that has been accrued. When a city goes bankrupt, it can be bailed out by a state. Or when a state goes bankrupt in the United States of America, it's common for the federal government to bail out that state. And we've all seen that happen. We have a lot of experience with that. Here's the question: what happens when the debt of the nations of an entire planet becomes greater than the GDP, than what they are producing? What happens when an entire planet goes bankrupt? Who bails out a planet? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know that anyone does. I think we're going to find out, because the debt of the entire planet now is essentially, we are a bankrupt planet. The major economic nations have assumed a policy of creating this debt, and the money is leveraged to such a degree. I think it will be very difficult to ever realistically pay down the debt, including America's debt. I think America right now, our debt ratio is about 105%, which means we owe more than we're able to produce by over 5%. Other nations, 30 and 40% over that. So if that were you and me, we would say that we're bankrupt, and we wouldn't be allowed to function any longer. Nations continue. But this debt accumulates, and it accumulates because of the interest that is owed on the debt we're paying. So it is an unsustainable cycle. Something's got to give. The question is, do we have a soft landing? Do we have leaders who are proactive and are willing to actually lead nations and the world together into a new form of economy? Or do we have a hard landing? Do we have a crash landing where we wait for the system to break and then we say, okay, here's what we're going to do? I don't know the answer to that. But what I know is this is precisely the reason that the conversation we had a little earlier about localized economy is important. Because what we saw the last time the economy crashed is that localized economies are affected much, much less, to a lesser degree, than centralized economies. So to the degree that we can keep our money local, and again, rural communities in northern New Mexico, Colorado, I'm familiar with because that's my home. We encourage buying locally, buy our produce locally, buy our automobiles locally instead of going to another another city, maybe where you get a little bit better deal. We spend more money to keep the money local. These are the things I think that will help sustain us as individuals. The United States debt, a lot of people don't understand why it happened. We've had tremendous amounts of debt before. World War II, the debt we ran up was tremendous to fight a war, and we paid it back almost immediately when citizens, you and I, we bought savings bonds. A savings bond was us buying a bond. It was loaning the government some money. I mean, when I was a kid, for my birthday, my grandparents would always proudly hand me, here's a United States savings bond. You save it until its maturity and you'll put yourself through college, or something like that. But we did that. We paid back the debt. Also, we levied something called an income tax, which did not exist prior to that time. So people say, well, we paid it back then. Why can't we pay this debt? Because we already have used all of the ammunition that we have. We already have the income tax. We can't implement something we already have. The savings bonds, we have bonds as well. They're called something a little different, but they're worked in the same way. And the third thing I want to say very quickly is up until early 1970s, our currency was linked, it was pegged to something that was solid, tangible, and real. It was linked to gold. Gold was about $32 an ounce. And every dollar that we held in our hand was a paper representation, a convenient way of using that gold rather than carrying heavy gold around or silver in your pocket. You say, this piece of paper represents that, and it actually said a silver certificate on the dollar bill, or we knew that dollars were backed in gold. 1971, President Nixon decoupled the US dollar from the gold standard. So that meant that we could begin printing more money than the gold could back. And this is where we started getting into trouble. This is where the debt and the inflation actually began. So there are proposals now to go back to some kind of a gold standard. Whether that happens or not, I don't know. China is amassing tremendous amounts of gold to give them financial credibility, and they'd like to go to the gold standard. India is doing the same thing. Russia is doing the same thing. So there is a movement we're seeing in the markets of nations amassing tremendous amounts of gold, presumably so that they can peg their currencies to this tangible asset once again, and maybe get this debt under control for a soft landing. We'll keep our eyes peeled and see what happens. But this is where it looks like we're going with all of this. I think it's obvious to anyone who is in any way engaged in the world that we are in fact living a time of extremes, and those extremes are touching every facet of our lives. The question that comes up so many times, and that I ask myself constantly, how do we keep positive? I mean, how do we keep a positive outlook and live our lives in a meaningful, productive way, in a useful way, every day of our lives, knowing that all these things are happening? That's one of the reasons that I've created Missing Links for you, because I want you to know why I'm optimistic about our future. I've never been more optimistic about my nation, the United States, your nation, all nations, the world, our future. I've never been more optimistic. And here's the reason why. Because we now know what doesn't work. We know what's broken. We know what's not sustainable on the one hand, and on the other hand, we already have all the solutions to all the big problems in the world. They already exist. We don't have to get all of the leaders of the corporations and the politicians and the spiritual and the religious leaders and the scientists and engineers and technological people together in a room and say, okay, figure this out. Because we did that in the 20th century. We have all the solutions to all the big problems. We have all the food we need to feed every mouth of every child, every woman, every man on the face of the earth. We have the ability to create energy, free energy, with zero greenhouse gases and no fossil fuels, and we've had that for over 60 years. We've already determined that we know how to build an economy based upon sharing and cooperation, which is very different from an economy of competition and scarcity, where one person has what other people need and they leverage that. It's a very, very different way of thinking. We already have all these things. Here's what's lacking. People say to me, if we've got all this stuff, where is it? Why don't we see it now? We're lacking the leadership that makes it a priority to implement these things in our world. We're lacking the leadership that makes it a priority to bring into our lives what already exists in the world. These things, they already exist, and they're waiting to be implemented. However, we have leadership. And I'm not saying it's the fault of any one person or any nation. I'm saying this is a way of thinking. And I think many of us as individuals are guilty of this as well. Because no one in the media, the media typically has never acknowledged that we're going through this big change. And so many people, it's important for the media to say at some point, the world has changed and we're living a new normal. So without having said that, so many of us, consciously and subconsciously, are waiting for things to get back to normal. We're seeing these extremes as a little speed bump in the road of life. And we're waiting for things to settle down, waiting for the dust to settle. The speed bump is the new normal. Volatility is the name of the game for our lifetimes and probably our children's lifetimes, because we're living the transition of a global society. It doesn't mean it's bad. It just means if we are clinging to the ideas, the old ideas of the world that used to be, and we're waiting for things to get back to normal, there's no room emotionally, psychically, there's no room to embrace the new world that's already here. And think about this in your own life. Think about this with a relationship. If you are filled to the brim with the love and the passion of a new romance, there's no room to entertain another romance, because you're wired for the one that's present in your life. And I'm using that as an example because in many respects, the romance that we've had with the world of the past, if we are filled to the brim with expecting the climate, the weather to behave a certain way, for spring to start on a certain day, the rain to come at a certain time, for the economy to move within certain boundaries, if we're waiting for that world is gone. And the new world now is this world of volatility. But the volatility is where we can embrace the new discoveries, bring in the new economy, bring in the new forms of energy, bring in the new jobs, bring in the new forms of healing, bring in the new forms of communication. It's all already there. We lack the leadership that is willing to make it a priority to bring these beautiful, beautiful, amazing, powerful discoveries to the people of the earth, to give us the quality, the healthy, lives, the quality of life that we all know is possible. So within that quality of life, we can thrive, create, innovate, and bring to the world our heart's desire, and that's the world we all know is possible. So what does that mean for us? As long as we live in communities or nations or societies where we choose to elect people to represent us, it's incumbent upon us to hold those elected officials accountable, to represent our views and our values. And when they don't, we need to let them know about that. So this is where the processes all come into play. It brings in a lot of ideas, and it touches on a lot of things I am very passionate about because I know the world that's possible. And we're right there. We're right there. And we're going to see it in this lifetime. And I vote for a soft landing. So when people ask me about where we are in this time in history, and many people are literally asking me, how do we get out of this mindset of scarcity? This is one of those places where the answer is in the question, because the idea of scarcity is nothing more, nothing less than a mindset. It doesn't exist in the world. It exists in our perception and what we're willing to accept in the world, perhaps more importantly, what we're willing to accept of ourselves. Every one of us is a being that needs to create, to express in our lives, in our world in some way. Our creations and our expressions are the fuel that give meaning to our lives and contribute in a meaningful way to our society and to our economy, if we're talking about that specifically. So when people have asked me, I have never felt a scarcity in my life, although when I was young, my father left our family. We were broke. We were in debt. That means you're broke and beyond broke. We were so in debt, we lived in government-subsidized housing. We moved every year. I went to a different school in some really rough neighborhoods. I never felt that idea of scarcity because I always had the opportunity to make my life better. I always had the opportunity to find some way to contribute, doing something that would benefit someone else and benefit me as well. And I think this is the key. If we're relying upon our sense of abundance, if we rely upon the external world to give that to us emotionally and psychically, it will show up in our physical world. So if we're relying on the outer world for our sense of well-being, for our abundance, and if we believe that it is a right for us to have it, we will be disappointed continuously because the universe doesn't see it as a right. It's an opportunity to create for ourselves. And when we recognize, we perceive the abundance that is already present, and it's not just about money. Money is simply an energy, and we're talking about energy here. When we begin to see the abundance that we have in our lives, and people say count your blessings, and I give thanks of gratitude the last thing before I go to sleep every night. I give thanks for the day that has been and the day that is yet to be. The day that has been, I will go through the highlights and the important things and the people and what they shared with me, how they made me feel, what they offered me and their stories, what they offered me in the ways that we've collaborated and worked together. I give thanks for every one of those things. And then I give thanks for the day that is yet to be, the day that will dawn when I awake is full, it is ripe, it is pregnant with possibilities. And every one of those is a potential. Abundance is a consciousness. It's a state of being. And my experience is as we embrace that on the emotional level and receive the abundance that is offered to us in so many ways every day, that shows up in our economic and our financial lives as well. It has to. And that's different than simply going out and saying, I need to make money, because that comes from a place of lack, saying I don't have any. And this is where I find people that have the greatest unhappiness, because they'll always compare what they're doing to others around them, and they'll always see themselves as less than. Perfect example, I just had someone recently say to me, don't you think it should be illegal for people like Bill Gates to make the money that he has made? And I surprised him with the answer, and my answer was no, I don't think that, and here's the reason why. Bill Gates is a brilliant man. He had an idea that changed the planet, and he fought to implement that idea when it wasn't well received, and I was working in the industry when this was all happening. He has empowered hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. Is he a wealthy man? Yes. And he has created hundreds of other wealthy people, given people jobs. New technologies have spun off from the idea that one man had. Why would I ever want to limit his abundance? The same thing with Facebook, the founder of Facebook. Same thing, the founder of Amazon. Same thing. There was a list of the wealthiest people in the world. In no way do I think those people should have been limited when it comes to them expressing their potential in the past. When it comes to the nuts and bolts of tax laws and things like that, it's a whole different story. But the principle of what has happened with them is they were inspired, just like you and I. And they took that inspiration and they made it into something real. And that reality has changed our planet. You can do that. I can do that. Together we can do it. And when we begin looking at things this way, the idea of scarcity simply becomes obsolete. So as we come to the close of this episode, if there was a single word that I could offer to you, my viewing audience, that would embody my sense for everything that we've talked about, that could give us that sense of security in the world of volatility and uncertainty, what would that be? And when I ask myself the same question, the word that comes to me just like that is honesty. I think it's important that we are honest with ourselves about the world that's at our doorstep, about what we're up against individually and collectively, honest, truthful, and factual about what the new discoveries are showing, and that's why I've created Missing Links, and honest with ourselves about what it takes to implement this new world. I am optimistic, and I'm also a realist. I'm under no illusion that takes a lot of work to shift the thinking within a single generation of how we've lived our lives and what money means to us and what savings and retirement and education and energy and all those things mean. It's all changing right now. I think it's exciting. It takes work. And as I've mentioned previously in this episode, the prophet Khalil Gibran said to us, work is our love made visible. It takes a lot of work to change the way we think. I think we're worth it. And I think this world is worth it. And I think it's worth the work that goes into it, because that work is our way of loving ourselves and loving the world. It's our love made visible.